In the last of a three-part miniseries, architect-developer Jonathan Tate talks about why he elected to raise money through the SEC-registered small change funding portal through crowdfunding rather than taking a single check from one investor. Welcome to the National Real Estate Forum podcast, episode 211. Thank you for joining me today. I am Dr. Adam Gower, and this is the Crowdfund Project at nreforum.org, where developers, investors, and industry leaders share insights that you can use to raise capital, build wealth, and earn passive income from crowd-funded real estate deals. Many years ago, I was searching for a tenant for the duplex unit next to the one in which I was living. A young family applied and told me they were considering my duplex versus another one in Santa Monica, which was a few miles away on the other side of town. Larry, the applicant, who was later to take the unit and become a dear close friend, had just been hired as a neurosurgeon at a hospital that was 5 minutes from my place. I explained to him that the commute from Santa Monica each day during rush hour could easily take him an hour. That would be 1 hour each way, so 10 hours a week, 500 hours a year. So over 10 working weeks each year eaten up sitting in traffic. One impact of the housing shortage in America currently is that people who are forced to make the kind of decision that Larry had actually have no choice because there is nothing affordable within a reasonable commute of their place of work. When home prices become as unaffordable as every real estate cycle starts to reach its peak, communities suffer because members of those communities cannot afford to live nearby and are forced out to the peripheries, and this in turn exacerbates traffic congestion, creating a vicious cycle of urbanization and sprawl. Finding a solution to this problem is an ecosystem of socially conscious architects and developers, and now, thanks to crowdfunding regulations, there is an alternate means for them to finance their initiatives. Not only that, but using real estate crowdfunding platforms, anyone can invest in these deals. In this way, crowdfunding is democratizing real estate finance. It is a right that we have always had, but that has until now only been accessible to the privileged few. It's a bit like the right to vote, in the sense that by electing what kind of real estate to invest in, we can decide what gets built in our neighborhood and so can directly influence how our communities develop. If you have a project that is socially conscious, helps to build the community in which it is located, and for which you need finance or in which you would like to invest, contact me at the show notes page for today's episode at the nationalrealestateforum.org website at nreforum.org/Jonathan, and I will send you some resources to help you along the way. Funding portal website. In the first episode, I spoke to founder and CEO of Small Change, Eve Picker. Last time I spoke to Bill Bedell, who is the first person to have invested in a regulation crowd-funded real estate deal. My conversation today is with Jonathan Tate, the third of the trifecta. Jonathan is an architect-developer whose deal was the first regulation crowdfunding deal on the Small Change platform. All right, so I have spoken to two people in your world, so I'm quite happy to be talking to you. I spoke to Eve, of course, who made the kind introduction. And then yesterday, I spoke to your first investor.
Oh, no, you're kidding me. Wow. Okay.
Yes. And he's quite famous because he claims to be the first crowdfund RegCF investor ever. So I'm going to see if I can actually, I told him that if I can actually verify that, I'll get him a plaque.
Yeah, no kidding. No kidding. He can pin it up. Was it intentional? Or is it just coincidence he jumped on board and now he can claim?
No, Bill spent some time tracking Eve's site and wrote some code, in fact, to check to see when the page that was talking about your deal changed. So he set himself an alert. So every time the page changed, he got a note. And when it changed and said, ready to invest, he jumped on it, apparently. So he was very much, wow, right? You should read the stuff that he's written. This guy he's a rocket scientist, honestly.
Oh, you're kidding me.
No, yeah. Out there. He's actually now a biology, some kind of, he calls it something engineering. I don't know what it is. He constructs blood cells. He figured out how leopards get their spots. I'm not kidding you. And now he's got a PhD, and he's all over. He's online. He's figured out all kinds of things. So anyway, he's a nice fellow. So anyway, that's two people. So you're actually, you make the trifecta. Maybe we could start, if you're okay, Jonathan, maybe we could start with, just give me kind of a background. Who are you? What do you do? Where do you come from? What have you done before? And just how have you come to where you are now?
I'm an architect, to put it sort of plainly, I guess. I run a small architectural practice in New Orleans, Louisiana, which you probably know all of this. But historically speaking, I'd say our office or my personal interest has always been in exploring, different possibilities and just intellectual curiosity, let's say, and all the work that we do is so single-minded. In other words, like we haven't spent 10 years working on this thing and trying to figure out, why leopards have their spots, so to speak, or anything to that effect. It's just we tend to sort of meander a little bit, and again, we like to be experimental, and so our work is contemporary in style, I would say, but less so. Let's say the manifestation of the work is I care about the ideas behind the work. But to back up a little, or to sort of jump into this process and this project that got us involved in the RegCF is have throughout my career, and I've been practicing for 20 years now, so I'm a little bit more than that, I believe. And so young as an office, but I wouldn't say quite middle age, but just somewhere past a teenager, let's say, in the professional realm. But we have always been interested in housing, and that's sort of an undercurrent of our practice and what we focus on and what we work on, and across the spectrum, whether it's private. But we have always been interested in housing, and that's sort of an undercurrent of our practice and what we focus on and what we work on, and across the spectrum, whether it's private clients or for a single family house, or whether it's a multifamily project for affordable housing, whatever. I mean, we're sort of looking across a lot of different realms. And so housing is again, always been an interest in our work. And again, when I say I mean, our office is interested often in sort of urban scale issues, right? So things that aren't necessarily don't always revolve around the individual architectural artifact, if you will, but engage a larger dynamic that we see happening in our urban environments, let's say.
So have you done development deals yourself over the years, or are you primarily and exclusively focused on architecture?
We're an architectural firm, and like what I tell everyone when we start talking about this project is like the last thing I want to be is a little bit, but and I often say I don't really have the expertise, let's say, to be a qualified developer, if you will, but also it's not sort of in my blood to be a developer. It's just I'll explain how we got there through the process. Sure. And so, yes, to answer your question, our work has predominantly been around just being in architecture and architectural practice. We do a lot of work for developers, and I think a lot of times architects, even though it's sort of the nature of the beast, if you will, to work with developers and developer organizations, and there's, at least historically, you in the professional realm, is like there's often friction between what development goals are and what architectural agendas are, right, as you might imagine. And the first thing that gets compromised often in that process is the architectural agenda. And I have to say that what I find actually more interesting is trying to exercise an architectural agenda while also addressing the developer's imperatives, right? And so the challenge that we've always had is like, how do we do both, and how do we be smart about doing both so that we get, we actually do more thoughtful work as a consequence. And so instead of resisting it, we sort of, always try to flow with it and make something out of it. And so anyway, work with developers for years and certainly understood, just from the consultant side of things, what the pressures were and what the general parameters are around development. But again, have never been a developer, so to speak, until now.
But now you are. So let's back up and describe the project that you've got, and then let's talk about how you ended up deciding how to finance it. So tell me about this project that our friends Eve and Bill have been involved in. Tell me about that. What is it?
Yeah, it started as an idea maybe 2 to 3 years ago now, somewhere in that, let's say 2.5 years ago. And what it entailed was actually a couple of things, but primarily a conversation that I got started, or they got started with a collaborator, or actually a development rep that we were working with on another project, where he and I began discussing the sort of, let's say, the conundrum of housing in New Orleans at the time. And what the city was seeing was, in effect, what a lot of cities were and still are seeing, which is just an increase in housing prices and the sort of inversion that's created as a consequence, where people are getting pushed out basically to the periphery, and the cost of housing in the city, or at least adjacent to the downtown, or however you want to define that, was just getting exorbitantly expensive, and it was pushing out the kind of people that, like myself, who were trying to live here, right, and that were attracted to the city. And you could say the historic parts of New Orleans where things weren't available at a decent price point. And so, and we were seeing that happen, right? And the other thing we were noticing, Chuck and I, and then again, anecdotally, this is all our colleagues around us are facing the same things. It seems like nobody's really addressing it. And certainly the cost of housing, but also the type of housing that was available. And often what you find are renovations of existing housing stock, or if it's new, then it's sort of the recreation of existing housing stock, if you will, just the kind of manufacture of new homes that look old. And nobody was really offering sort of middle market, custom design or contemporary design housing, and we just thought there was a gap, right? So that's where it started.
Yeah, and now the other thing that you've done is you've found gaps in the landscape, haven't you?
Yeah, and so that's how we were able to act. So that's how we were able to act on this sort of impulse, or was looking for land opportunities, because as you well know, the pressure, the development pressure on the city, any developable lots were either priced, way out of our realm, I should say, and our limited resources, but also it's what was fundamentally driving up the cost of housing. So our approach was to try to find a land play that meant you didn't start out with a heavy investment in land cost right off the bat, right? So cheap land, so to speak, but cheap land in areas of the city that it would be hard to find something like that.
So there's a screen on your website that has what I think is a page of all the land lots in New Orleans. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
It looks like Morse code, but it isn't. Is that really the land lot? That's a fascinating image you pulled together there.
Well, it is identify as a buildable lot, let's say,
right.
And we refer to them as non-conforming or small lots or odd lots, however you want to say it. The bonus of that is that most of the folks that were developing housing in this sort of single-family infill housing really weren't interested in them, at least initially, because they have a model, it doesn't fit. There's just a lot of headspace to figure these things out, and it's like they were just skipping over it anyways, if they even knew they existed. And so what we did was a bit of research in our office and just basically located all this property. And we did overlays of zoning. And so what were the zoning regulations that permitted those lots to be used? What were the lots that were actually, let's say, buildable? In other words, they weren't just an abandoned alleyway in the middle of a city block or something, but it had street frontage or whatever. But then also we're in areas of the city that we felt like we wanted to engage, right? So abandoned alleyway in the middle of a city block or something, but it had street frontage or whatever. But then also we're in areas of the city that we felt like we wanted to engage, right? So when we filtered it all out, I think the image you're referring to, there was like 5,000 lots or something like that.
And so what's the name of your project? The one that's on Small Change? Okay,
what we call the whole process, and we've referred to it as just starter home with an asterisk. Like we couldn't really think of, it's in effect a starter home, or at least the way we think of as a starter home. Right. But normatively speaking, that would be a greenfield development, right? So this is different than that. So the star is sort of a footnote, if you will. It's like, well, yes, but no.
I did look at the page to try and find that asterisk explained somewhere and couldn't find it.
Yeah. Well, this is the explanation.
This is the explanation, right?
Yeah.
All right. So give me to know what stage you're at now. But before you did, how were you describing this deal to people out there when you were initially try to find capital?
Kind of put it together.
Yeah.
Well, okay. So as it started out, the pitch, as it were, was, new infill housing catering to first-time and last-time home buyers, in this case, that were middle market, in other words, not deeply affordable but not high-end market housing, that offered entry opportunities into historic neighborhoods that were quickly sort of closing up, availability sort of closing up due to the escalation of housing costs in the kind of inner city areas.
And mid-range affordable by design, presumably, right? Because of
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. And to do that, land costs, which we've already talked about, was one of the metrics that we were working on. So so there was cost in land. It just, to use numbers for a second, a standard housing lot in a neighborhood that we're interested in could be $300,000 if you can get it, right? So you can imagine what the base price of a house would need to cost to absorb that land value. What we were able to find was land that averaged between, let's say, $30,000 and $50,000 a lot, right? Oh. Which is still not cheap, but significantly less than.
Yeah, that's a huge discount to the market, isn't it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing was just right sizing the house. So we're not trying to build tiny houses or small houses necessarily, but just addressing the kind of inflation of square footage that we've seen over the past few decades in standard family single family housing. It's like, how do we shrink it down? And you do that through just more efficient design, basically, and layouts, and just smarter footprint. But the family, single family housing, it's like, how do we shrink it down? And you do that through, just more efficient design, basically, and layouts, and just smarter footprint. But the lots themselves sort of necessitate that as well.
Okay, so how big is the Stata Home Lot?
Okay, so let me explain for a second. There's an arc to this. Basically, we now have either under development or in construction or constructed, I think 17 houses, something like that in total, right? And
okay, so that you are developing.
Yeah, exactly, okay. That we're developing and that are part of the starter home piece. And so these two houses that we've crowdfunded are just two that belong to this whole index of housing, right?
Okay.
And so in that matrix, they all look at the small lot or the non-conforming lot condition. So that's sort of a baseline, like we're looking for land that people aren't necessarily looking at to build on, right? So that's one beta, which is how Eve found us, which I can get into that in a minute as well, was small lot, small house, speculative, which is another big component of this. We're not designing these for any one particular individual, but they're truly spec housing. And we put it out there and sold it. So that was the first one that we did. We got a lot. We designed and built a home on it, and we were able to sell it. So we completed that process roughly the same time Eve had engaged us about doing to work with her in small change. Okay. As that process was going, we constructed another home, which was for an individual, but it's a self-built home. And so what we're referring to as a small lot, but was actually something that somebody could build on their own. And coincidentally, I said earlier, we don't do tiny houses. And it is the smallest permitted house in the city of New Orleans.
How many square feet?
It's less than 200. It's like 190 something. I think 192, something like that. It is the absolute. Well, you could squeeze a square foot or two out of it, but it's basically the smallest house that code will allow.
Sounds like a tent.
Yeah, it's kind of that,
with rigid walls.
Yeah, with rigid walls, exactly. But he, incredible client. Long story there, but this was a client that came to us, and we sort of turnkeyed it with him. So when I say we developed it, this is our office working with them in order to get it constructed. There was another.
What did it end up costing him per foot to build that?
It was in total, it was like $16,000 or something like that to build the house. The land was $5,000 and the house was around $16,000. So I don't have a calculator.
$100 a foot or something? Less than $100.
Yeah, less than 100.
Incredible.
Another home that we did for this is a long meandering story, so I'm probably missing some details here, but about the time that our first house started getting publicity and Eve got wind of what we were up to, the city was actually the city of New Orleans was auctioning off a number of their abandoned and vacant properties throughout the city. And in that mix were as it turns out, a number of these non-conforming lots. And so we had an interview. It was on the local news in a few places, and NPR ran it, stuff like that. So people started about the exact same time that this auction was happening. We were getting press for this project, and so our phone starts ringing from people who just bought these funny little lots and they don't know what to do with it, and they were calling us. It's like, can you help us with this? Can you help us with this? And a lot of that sort of shook out, but one couple we ended up again sort of turnkeying a project for them. So that's where, as I like to say, we had a private client come to us and basically fund our development and architectural agenda, right, which was kind of interesting. As a model, because it's usually, at least in the architectural world, another way around, where we're giving shape to someone else's ideas in a way. So
okay, so tell me about the small change project. How many square feet? How big's the lot? What have you got going there?
Yeah, so on the small change project, it's actually 2 parcels that we're working on. So it's 2 individual houses right next to one another. The lots are about 12 to 1,300 square feet apiece, I believe that's right. They're not so small, but they're not enormous either. Mm-hmm. They're definitely not a standard lot. And then the homes that are going on there are just a hair over 1,500 square feet.
Each.
So they're
double stack,
correct?
2 floors.
Yeah, that's correct. With one parking space each. So just standard old housing with 1 parking space each. So just standard old housing in a way.
Nice. So first of all, you've been financing these other deals either through private investors or you've been doing it on your own nickel, right, if you're doing spec homes.
Correct.
And
correct.
So what happened? You got a call from Eve. Tell me about the crowdfund story. How did that come about for this particular deal?
Well, so Eve, as I said, was aware of the work that we were doing, and she was visiting New Orleans because of a conference, and she reached out to sit down and meet, and just while she was in town, let's have a conversation. And so she wanted to hear more about what we were up to, and we wanted to hear more about what she was up to, and any chances we might be able to work together. It started there, actually, and so I was fascinated with the mechanism of financing something like this, and I think I should say that this is where my not being a developer is opening opportunities for people like me to actually do development, right? So if one hurdle, as we all know, is how you fund development, this is a way to sort of get past that hurdle. At least that's one opportunity or one possibility that I see with that. And so it caught my ear. I was very interested in it. We have people that help us with, any kind of equity or debt issues associated with the development. So it's not really that we needed the money necessarily. I just, in the spirit of going back to what I said earlier, the sort of spirit of investigating possibilities through our work, this was a fascinating possibility. And so we sat down, we started talking, and this was probably 2 years ago, and we haven't stopped since, I guess. Mm-hmm. So we tracked, the opening up of RegCF last year in May. The goal was to sort of be ready to go at that point, but it took a little longer to get everything in order to get the offering together. But we've actively, since that initial conversation, we've been in discussion about how to make this happen ever since. So,
if you have a deal that you would like to raise money for, please contact me using the form at the top of the show notes page to today's episode at the nationalrealestateforum.org website, nreforum.org/Jonathan. I will get back to you right away. Okay, so what is the process then? So let's say somebody has a deal similar to yours. They've got a lot somewhere and they got some architectural drawings and they want to build on it, but they don't have the cash to do it. Can you describe what the process is like from the developer's perspective?
Yeah, I think it's fairly systematic at this point. And I think, if you go through Small Change or I don't think there's another one out there, but let's just say hypothetically another portal that would do crowdfunding for real estate that you can present to the world, basically, in this case, that explains your project. So most generally speaking, that's what your objective is. I think a lot of that work is no different. In fact, I know a lot of that work is no different than a package you might put together and walk to a bank and say, here, let me tell you about my project and why you should invest in it. It not at all dissimilar in that case at all. I'd say you need to be able to tell a story about the project, and I would say it needs to be compelling to some extent. It needs to make financial sense, and you need to say why it makes financial sense, and you need to be able to talk about yourself and what your qualifications are. And those are kind of the fundamentals to putting something like that together.
And who are you telling that story to? You telling it to the portal, to Eve, or are you telling it to the investors, or is it a mix of both?
Well, you start out telling it to Eve for sure, to the portal, just because you want them interested and you want them to buy in and be willing to sort of host it. Part of I'm sure Eve went through this, but part of what the portal's responsibility is to make sure, and present to the world, to potential investors, deals that make sense to them and that they think would be of interest and have some legs on it, if you will, to other investors, right?
Now, she also checks you out, doesn't she? Doesn't she do background checks, and there's other layers beyond just your story, how she verifies it?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, what's that process like?
Well, there is a background check where, we pay $85 or whatever it is to have her run through a company, just to do a background on who we are and make sure, do all the regulatory, checkup on us and so forth. But I think a lot of on who we are and make sure, do all the regulatory, checkup on us and so forth. But I think a lot of the vetting actually comes through conversation and mechanisms that Eve has in place that says, okay, I need to get to know these people. I need to know something about them. I need to see evidence that, they know what they're doing. And I need to, and Eve should say this and not me, but I think fundamentally I need to be able to trust these people, right? And right. Who they are and what they're up to.
All right, so you get through that stage. Now you've put together your pitch deck and you've explained it to the portal and you've had a background check run, so everything's good, and she says, all right, you're good to go on the portal. Now what happens?
Well, there's a whole bunch of in between there, which I won't get into, but there are forms to fill out and submitting to these offerings. Aside from that, and without getting into the kind of weeds on that,
well, without getting into the weeds, let me ask you though: was that a headache, or was it relatively painless?
I look at all of this stuff, and I'm fascinated by it, and it may take time, but I'm learning, and so I don't find that to be a headache. Now, if you're one of limited patients, you may have a different attitude about it, but I think we, in a lot of ways, and again, Eve would probably say this as well, it's like we treated this first offering as like, here, we're going to work the kinks out, right? And so naturally along the way, we were feeling around in the dark in a few places, but we were able to sort of get through it. And I think consequently, the next person, it's a lot easier. It should be a lot easier.
Very good. Okay. So now you've got everything up, and then you had to upload it to the website, or did you just send all your materials to Small Change and they uploaded it for you? Did they?
It's sort of, there's a bit of back and forth there, and it's just how, fundamentally we're preparing all the material, but obviously for her to get it online so that it works in the way her website works, there's manipulation and development on her part. Okay. But essentially it's our responsibility to pull the material together. And in our case, since we actually had a long story to tell, as you're witnessing in this conversation, about what we were trying to do, so we needed to distill that in some way so that people understood what we were up to, with this one project and how it connected to a larger objective.
Okay, so now you've got this thing up on the website, you've got your deal on the website. How did you make sure that there were people there ready to take a look? Right? Mm-hmm. So you don't just put it up and then sat in a darkened room waiting for somebody to click on it, right?
Well, which is exactly what I did, but I think that's where that's where the portal sort of comes into play there. So Small Change Network, that they have worked for a few years now to develop, and this is followers, people that have signed up to newsletters and and get announcements about, opportunities that are coming through the site. So she, and I don't know the exact number, but she has a pool of people that she can immediately send information to for any of the offerings, right? And so we were relying on that fundamentally, I would say, as the starting point for how people might actually be aware of and alerted to the offering. So that's where it began. There was a kind of a loose marketing plan that was in place as we were moving forward. And so to go through all the pieces, one was, as I just described, we were relying on Small Change, their network, and what, who they were connecting with. We put a sign out on the site, that, hey, here's an opportunity to engage in funding. I did personal outreach and alerted people to the project and to the process. And then we sat and waited, actually. And then, and it was a 3-month raise. So just to sort of talk through that, it was a 3-month raise. The first month when it came out, a lot of activity. People immediately, we had a good burst of folks that jumped on board right away. I'd say majority of that came from Eve's network.
Let's just contextualize this. You were looking for 90,000, but you set a minimum of 40, right? Is that right?
It was 95 and a minimum
95.
of 40 or 45, something like that. Yeah. And we hit our minimum really quickly, I would say. And perhaps in that first window, and I say a month, but like a third of the raise, the first third of the raise, it went. The middle third was fairly quiet and dormant. Actually, I'd say like not a whole lot of activity. And people were investing, but it wasn't the kind of quick pop that we got right away. And then the last third was really active, where we sort of closed the gap and made it all the way to our ultimate goal, which was the 95,000. And that came through an aggressive marketing campaign from Small Change at that point. And so this is when they're doing targeted ads to people, and things really started picking up at that point.
Okay, so your contribution to the marketing was somewhat limited to the early stages, and within your capacity, you relied more heavily on Small Change to get.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. This is, and we may back up and talk a little bit about what I've learned from the process, but this is definitely, who this is suited for, and I'd say everybody, but there's certain people that I can imagine afterwards that would have a better go at this, and I'd say, folks with a very large social media or just follower, in the most general terms, footprint, right? So if you already have like an embedded audience associated with you that you can reach out to, then, that's the best platform I think you could have starting out with, right? Like, here's what, that are familiar with what you do, say you're a development organization or you're a nonprofit, whatever it is, then that, your base, if you will, if you've got a large one, then that's great. You have a very small base. Like, we don't have followers, we don't have any of those things. There's certainly people familiar with our work, but it's not like we send out email blasts to 20,000 people every month or something. We don't have that kind of outreach, right? So I'd say we were hampered to some extent for that reason.
Okay. So now this is the only deal that you've done using Small Change and crowdfunding a development deal, but you've got, you said 17 deals in play at the moment. Is there any reason why you've decided not to do more deals using the same formula?
No, we actually, we're in discussion on at least 2 other projects right now to go about it this way, actually, to use the RegCF. And out of the 17 that I've described, these are the last 2 that are being developed. And so what we're looking at now are actually other project types that we're in discussion with Small Change to do.
So why do you favor Small Change over other traditional sources of finance? Are you able to raise it from friends and family, and you just think this is more socially relevant somehow, or what's your motivation for using Small Change?
Well, that's interesting. It is number one. I just, again, and maybe this is short-sighted, but I'm just infinitely curious with how this works and how people engage the work through the act of assisting with the funding, right? So it's like the person you described, the first person to develop. It's like those are all stories, and I'm kind of captivated by that, and that these people are interested in what we're doing, and that by extension I can be exposed to what they're doing. That to me is as fulfilling as anything, right? So that is a dynamic that you're not going to find with here we have an investor that we work with all the time. It's like we really enjoy working with these people, but it's like let's broaden what we're up to, and also that's limited. And frankly, we don't have a big pool of investors or friends and family that are willing to sort of give money to us. So this is, in some ways by necessity, this is a platform that we can go to and help fill that gap, right?
How many investors do you have in the first RegCF deal that you did with Small Change?
It's somewhere between 35 and 40. I forget. I think it's like 38, somewhere in that range. So,
not many at all then.
No,
and you actually ended up raising 95,000, didn't you?
That's correct. Yeah,
the full amount with only 30 people. Yeah. Okay, interesting. So what is the communication like with them? How do you communicate with them?
Well, through email primarily, and so we try to correspond, and let them know what's happening with the project, and that is an obligation on our end. Actually, as investors, we need to keep them appraised of the progress on the project and how are we meeting expectations and what was stated in the original raise. It's like, where do we stand, schedule, where are the monies, and so forth. And so we primarily do that through email, and we've also set up a little web portal that people can kind of plug into and just get updates.
And that's something that Small Change facilitates as well, isn't it?
Nope.
It isn't?
No, that's ours. No, we do that. And this is something that, and again, I'm not entirely sure if Eve elaborated on this, essentially they're there to host an offering, and that's it. And when the offering's done, they close up, and then it belongs to us to manage the rest of it, right?
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
But do you have mandated reporting requirements?
Correct.
You do. What do those look like? Are they?
I think once a year. It's like I need to tell everybody what's up once a year. It's really, for all the regulation and you can't do this, you can do that. Well, really, mostly you can't do this, you can't do that. They're really vague in how we're supposed to report to people, and in that how we communicate with our investors is really limited to here. Once a year, this is what we're up to. At least in by strict definition, as I understand it from the regulations. But look at it this way: like whether it's a single investor or whether it's 38 investors, it's like you can't leave people in the dark, and you're cultivating a relationship with these people.
Well, that's right.
Them to know. Yeah.
Well, you've got a deal that's got a 12-month lifespan, right?
That's
so
right.
if you only have to report once a year, then technically I suppose you could just say, right, here's our annual report, we sold it.
Yeah, exactly.
Here's your check.
Yeah, it's all done. So, so that's a part of it. And again, like I don't know, I tell people this that have asked about the process. It's like if you're somebody that gets nervous about having one of our projects in particular, we have a investor. If you're somebody that gets nervous about having one of our projects in particular, we have a investor, and there's an obligation, monthly, if not more frequently than that, to sort of make sure we're telling them everything that's going on, and here's where we stand with things. And there's a little kind of anxiousness associated with that, because you want to make sure, like, look, are we telling you everything you need to know? Are you okay? If that sort of in the back of your mind pressure is anxiety that you don't like to deal with, and it's not just one person, it's 38 people. You could look at it that way. And so I actually have a little bit of that anxiety, I should say, and so I feel obligated, and I want to make sure that I'm like communicating with people, and that they, again, we're just getting started, honestly, but we're trying to set up ways so that they know what's going on, and we sort of fold them into the process, and they can pay attention as much as they want, right, on the coast. And then we've got people as far out as Australia, actually.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and I'll say this: the interesting thing about how this thing got funded, and we can look at what the expectations and aspirations are for just RegCF in general, but there are 3 people from New Orleans that participated in this.
Oh. You, your partner, and your best friend.
Yeah, exactly. Something like that. Actually, 3 people I don't know, as it turns out, because all the, back to what I said, my role in trying to strum up participants in this was to do solicitation to my network. Out of that network, nobody invested. So just so you know, I'm not holding that against everyone, but that's not entirely true, but it's basically true. And then, but weirdly enough, like the location of this project is in a neighborhood that is really sort of off the beaten path. I mean, it's a good neighborhood and it's a good place to develop, but it's not a throughway. For instance, there's not a lot of car traffic. And Eve was insistent about getting a sign on the site, and we're like, okay, let's get a sign on the site. We put the sign on the site. The person across the street invested. So it's really like, cool. Okay, so the sign worked.
Yes. Paid for itself. The sign paid for itself.
Yeah, basically. So, but again, like you never know who's gonna sort of come out and be interested in this. And then there were 2 other people that I think were really sort of pulled in due to the targeted marketing.
All right. So let me ask you then, what has been your biggest surprise with the RegCF process and the whole intellectual discovery of what this is?
That's actually, let me think. Probably going back to a response that I gave.
Process and the whole intellectual discovery of what this is.
That's actually, let me think. Probably going back to a response that I gave earlier. It's probably more of the watching the process evolve, right? So understanding or seeing how people from all over and just whether it's a biologist as you described or it's someone who works for an auto industry group or it's another architect that's involved, just the kind of people that have participated, that's captivating. And just to watch it sort of daily or weekly or whatever, like, oh, somebody from X just, gave $1,000. It's just seeing that. I didn't anticipate that. I'd say that is maybe it's not the biggest surprise, but it was revealing just to see how, again, captivating, just to sort of watch that process evolve and see how people, found it and their motivation for being involved in this. And the other thing I'd say is like how important it is in your role the developer's role in structuring a deal that made sense for this platform, which is different than if you were walking to a bank, if you were walking to an investor. It's just the dynamics are different, and your ability to sort of manipulate those dynamics are again, it's fascinating. I mean, really fascinating.
You don't find it burdensome to deal with 40 investors instead of just one? It was only $95,000, right? I mean, I presume it would have been... to answer, sorry to cut you off, but I had an investor that was ready and actually had been bothering me as the person who helped us on the first house, and by bother, I mean they were interested in what else are you doing? Right. Yeah, enthusiastic. It's like we're looking for something else. And I showed him this thing, and he's like, "You are crazy! Like, why are you doing this? Like, for $95,000, it just seems ridiculous." And for us, it was like it was the idea. It's like, well, you got to start somewhere. Let's see how this works. And in a lot of ways, it's like even if we didn't do another one, we needed to do this one, and just for the sake of and to benefit and to show the possibilities of this process, right? So. Is it a headache? Ask me a year from now, and I'd probably have a better answer for that. Right now, it's not been burdensome at all. In fact, it's been quite pleasurable and intriguing, and it's led to a lot of really incredible conversations. So, wow, fantastic! What a fabulous thing to hear. All right, so you've got two more deals coming down the pipe. What's the timing on those, Jonathan?
One should, let's say in the next 3 to 4, well, I should say sooner than that, maybe the next 2 to 3 months, there's one that should probably in the 6 month, time frame, something like that.
All right, wonderful. Okay, so based on your experience now with RegCF and this deal you did on Small Change, I have a feeling that I know what your answer is going to be, but would you recommend it to other developers? And, if so, what would it be that you particularly like about the process and the fundraising? What do you like about it that you would recommend?
Yeah, it is. Well, yeah, the answer. I would say yes. I would certainly recommend it to people that were interested in it. And I think what I like about it, again, is it raises awareness of your work in different scales of communities. And so if you're doing socially minded, urbanistically minded, whatever, you name it. If there's an agenda around your work, then it's a great platform for people both to see the work and to be able to contribute and help support it, right? So if that's embedded in the kind of agenda of your development, let's say, then this is an incredible way to sort of draw people into the project and allow them to participate. So I'd say that's sort of at a meta level what I say to a lot of people is an important value in this. The other, I think you have to look at the sort of number of investors and the kind of process that you have to go through, and does that make sense? I'd say Small Change is done a great job after hours as we move through another one to systematize the process. So I don't think it's onerous, and frankly, it's not that dissimilar to what you would do if you had to put this in front of a bank or another investor anyway. So I don't think you're doing more work per se. So there's not a lot to that. I think that, the question is, how big is the raise? How are you going to raise the money? Who are you targeting? So it's all those questions that you'd have to ask yourself and try to pair with this process to make sure that they were compatible, right?
Right. And then I suppose the other thing is, do you really want to be leaning completely on Small Change or on the portal
Correct.
for your marketing?
Well, it is what I would say, and is that if you're an organization, again, that has a social footprint, people are aware of you, they follow you, they kind of keep up with what you're doing, then in some ways you have a kind of built-in audience for something just like this, and you're one step ahead, right? So it's a chance that you can ask those people to actually engage in this, and so instead of being passive viewers, they can be active participants. So I think like that, then you're in a good place to actually actualize this as a process, much more so than someone that didn't have the same kind of following, if you will.
Jonathan Tate had no real need to finance his project through Small Change, as he already had an investor who was willing to write a check for the full amount that he needed. His interest in crowdfunding the deal, however, stems from his sense of community and his desire to truly democratize real estate and put control of the development process back into the hands of the people who benefit the most. If you have a deal that builds a community in some way and you want to raise money or to invest in a deal like that, let me know using the contact form at the top of the show notes page for today's episode at nreforum.org/Jonathan. I will personally follow up with you to show you how. In the next podcast, I have the pleasure of speaking to Amy Wan. Amy was formerly General Counsel at the crowdfund real estate platform Patch of Land. She describes herself as a legal hacker and now operates her own business, Bootstrap Legal, in which she has automated the legal documentation process to make it more accessible to everyone. If you find these podcasts of interest and would like to know more about real estate crowdfunding, please let me know at the nationalrealestateforum.org website, nreforum.org/contact. I would love to hear from you. Be sure to let me know if you need help raising capital for a deal, or if you're an investor looking for something to invest in. I would be happy to show you how you can do either or both. Thanks again for tuning in, and thank you also to architect-developer Jonathan Tate for sharing your time with me today.